Thank you for everyone who's joined with us today to launch the Queensland Child Rights Report 2025. I'm Mick Gooda. I come from two mobs in central Queensland, the Gungaloo and Yemen, a bit further south around Taroom. And on behalf, if I'm allowed to, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I am in Meanjin this morning. But for everyone right around Queensland, and if people are joining us from outside Queensland, and the custodians, the traditional owners of your country, I acknowledge those. I acknowledge all people joining us today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly young people, and I acknowledge non-Indigenous people who walk with us every step of the way we go through these challenges. Can I introduce the panel today? Of course, Natalie Lewis, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. Can you say hi, Nat? Nat?
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Casey Bird, Director of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Children's Commission, the Office of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. G'day, Casey.
G'day, Mick. G'day, everyone.
And Rhea Waia, First Nations Youth Leader. And when you go through the book, you'll see Rhea's foreword. It's brilliant. So if you do nothing else with the report, read the foreword. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a video conference, which I must admit, it's challenging for me. My girls call me a boomer, and as a boomer, you're not used to all this technical stuff. So it's going to be recorded, and I'm missing the vibe of having everyone in the one room with Natalie, Casey, and Rhea in different parts of the office here in Brisbane. But nevertheless, we'll get through this. Can also give people some heads up that this session will be recorded, and we probably, even though I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to technology, I've learned a few things through these. So if you're in a place where Wi-Fi is challenging, it's always handy to keep your camera turned off to at least you're going to get the spoken stuff. I think this report is, even though it's there today, and I've looked at it and I've gone through it, it's not just a report. It's actually something that has been done over the 12 months of 2025. It's a culmination of a lot of work by a lot of people, a lot of support, led by our fabulous Commissioner Natalie, and the staff like Casey and Amy Lemoyne and everyone else in the Children's Commissioner's office, and of course supported by the young people. I know Natalie will speak to this, but I absolutely have experienced her commitment to hearing these things. But I just wanted to say about that report, how it's a culmination of everything that was done in 2025, and I'll do a little bit of editorializing here. 2025 was really challenging for all of us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly those of us who work in the children's rights space. And we come forward on the basis of children's rights, and indeed all human rights in Queensland cannot be advanced unless our children are at the centre of this, of the approach. Today is a chance to reflect on children's rights, what children's rights look like in practice, where progress is being made and more work is needed. As I said, I'm joined by Natalie, Rhea and Casey today. But before we get into it, because this is really time managed, and people who know me know I like a yarn, so I've got someone throwing things at me if I keep on talking too much. But we've got a video from Professor Tobin from the Melbourne Uni. Is he from Melbourne Uni, John Tobin? So can we go with the message from Professor Tobin?
Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege to be part of this conversation today. I don't think I deserve to be here, but I'm very grateful that I am. So I've been working in the field of children's rights for over 25 years now. I've read a lot of reports. This one's special. At a time when children's rights are being marginalised within Australia and sadly overseas as well. This report puts them forefront every conversation concerning children. It says that governments must be accountable for the promises they've made. So it's an inspiring and courageous act that at a time when policies like adult time for adult crime, which emerged in Queensland, has been followed in Victoria, are making the lives of our young people, particularly our First Nations young people, so much harder, that Natalie and her team have stood up to the plate and shown a different way of developing policy and services for children. The second reason this is an important report is it maintains a standard by which all organisations working with and for children, whether government or in fact I'd say non-government, can think about the extent to which they are complying with their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It does across every sector: civil and political rights, youth justice, education, housing, care. Every aspect covered under the Convention on the Rights of the Child is outlined in this report with clear guidelines about the measures required by states to comply with their obligations under the CRC. Third, and I think most important part about this report for me, is the way in which it elevates the voices of First Nations youth. So the minute you pick up this report, you'll be struck by the cover of three powerful young Indigenous men, and then by the foreword by a very young, empowered and passionate Indigenous young person, Rhea. And this is what they say. As young people, we refuse to accept a Queensland where our rights can be suspended, our cultures sidelined, and our futures negotiated according to political convenience. Child rights are not optional, and neither is Indigenous sovereignty. It's a powerful message, right? And it's coming from the voice of a young person to all of us as adults. The challenge becomes how to respond. So in closing, I'd like to acknowledge, firstly, Natalie and her team for an extraordinary report. We need more people writing works like this in our country at this point in time. I also want to encourage and acknowledge the work of all the First Nations youth that are involved in this report. You should be extremely proud of what you've done. Now the obligation shifts to us as adults who can work with and join our First Nations youth and other youth around Australia to actually see if we can translate the aspirations and ideals of the Convention on the Rights of the Child into practice.
What a great message from John, and that's why I wanted at the beginning of this to acknowledge all the non-Indigenous people who work with us and walk with us. John's been around for 20 odd years doing this sort of work, and his message about hearing young people, they've got to lead the way, and with Natalie facilitating that with the work she does, I think it's a great message that we should all take on board. I'd like to now invite Natalie Lewis, Aboriginal and Torres on the Children's Commissioner, to provide an overview of the report, the key findings and what they mean for accountability, which I think, Natalie, is a key word in your report, making people accountable, not just young people accountable, but making governments accountable for what they do and more particularly what they don't do. So over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks for the quick recovery. You had me panicked there when I saw that screen go blank. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I think it's really important that I start by thanking the squad, the Office of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. We're a small but very committed group of people in the QFCC, and I certainly need to mention Dr. Bianca Kelly, who is the lead author for this report. It is an incredible amount of work, approached with an incredible amount of care, and I think Further to that, just want to also acknowledge the exceptional leadership of Amy Lemoyne in, helping us to get the report in the right technical space. And I think that, combined the efforts of everyone in our team, I think, also the Bender and Marga Youth Collective has stepped up the report from the first report that we released 2 years ago. So thank you. One of the key focus areas for this report this year centres around self-determination, and self-determination is just simply what determines whether a system fails or whether it works. When Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities lead, outcomes improve. When they don't, harm is not incidental, it's built in. Self-determination doesn't stop with communities, it includes young people themselves. And without that shift in power, there won't be any shift in outcomes. And so very powerfully, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people that were involved in our Gathering Strength Summit committed to continuing to work with us to shape the Spotlight chapter and to really position the power of the report in their voices. And I know John in his message read out part of the foreword, and again I encourage you to read that. It's an exceptional statement of the aspirations and the collective power of that group of young people. Also within the report, we make a really, I think, clear point in every single chapter about the importance of quality participation. Participation of children and young people is what makes systems relevant. So children and young people already speak, but it's systems that decide whether or not they're going to listen. So when our children are excluded, policy drifts, services miss, and harm increases. So without participation, systems become irrelevant. And the irrelevance in this context of our work is really dangerous. So too often, child participation becomes about performance, not influence. When we invite children and young people into rooms, we listen and then often proceed unchanged. What we're calling for in this report is to make a commitment to do better. There's a big focus, obviously, also in the report around youth justice and child protection. And I'm pretty sure when we sort of scan through the list of attendees today, it will be no secret to any of you that the outcomes are not great in either of those two spaces. The evidence isn't emerging, it's settled, it's decades deep, and it's repeatedly confirmed. We absolutely know what works. And the government is continuing to operate counter to evidence. When governments act against evidence, the harm that follows is not unforeseen. It is the point at which evidence was ignored that becomes the subject of the next cyclical inquiry. I think it's important, if we're trying to think about how we shift this, how we change it, we have to turn our minds to system design and transformation. The child protection and youth justice systems are not broken. They are working exactly as they were designed to work. They're producing the outcomes that they were built to produce. The design is the problem. You can't adjust your way out of a system that's functioning as it's intended. If the system isn't designed for children, it will not deliver for them. If we don't ask children and young people to participate in the design of the systems that are meant to improve outcomes for them, then it will fail to deliver the outcomes that we imagine. What is required is not reform, it's transformation. We emphasise across the report the importance of a child rights-based approach. It might be principles-based, but it's also operational. It demands decisions that are grounded in outcomes, in equity and accountability, not convenience and not political pressure. When rights are ignored, poor outcomes are not surprising. They are inevitable. If policy is not delivering for children, it is not aligned with their rights. One of the key calls in this report is for a generational children's plan for Queensland. That is not a radical ambition. It is pragmatic, it is evidenced, and it is an approach to better policy, better decisions, and better outcomes for kids. Bringing together social and economic policy across portfolios and sectors with a common tethering point of accountability for children's rights. And in actuality, we already have a solid starting point. Sometimes that we forget that we are a human rights jurisdiction. But importantly, the Child Safe Organisation scheme creates a common currency or a common language about our obligations to children, binding government, departments, service providers and child serving entities to a common purpose and responsibility. The National Child Safe Standards, which we have adopted in legislation in Queensland, have their genesis in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. While it doesn't comprehensively cover all articles of the convention, the Child Safe Standards and Universal Principle are fundamental children's rights. That is a fact. That is not ideology. That is law. To give practical effect to those rights, they must be evident in how policy decisions are made, and that implementation must go beyond wording or operational policies and live in practice that is seen, felt, and experienced by children and young people in every interaction. That is the intention of the Child Safe Organisation scheme, and that can become the foundation of a children's plan in Queensland. We do not have a system-wide governance architecture for children in Queensland. We have fragments. So without a clear blueprint that's grounded in children's rights, our efforts are often scattered, accountability is diluted, and progress is uneven or absent. Finally, I guess I'll close just on the significance of oversight and accountability. That is primarily the purpose of this Child Rights Report. Child rights is the measuring stick. It's applied as an objective test of purpose, policy, and practice when it comes to children and young people in Queensland. Oversight is not about reassurance, it is about truth. It requires independence, transparency, and a willingness to confront what is uncomfortable. If we have weak or politicised oversight, it will not protect children or improve their life outcomes. One of the primary reasons that we commenced this process of developing children's rights reports in Queensland was to make sure that the lived experiences of children in our state were not rendered invisible by the national approach to reporting on life outcomes for children. And I think that if we can continue to improve our understanding collectively about around human rights and children's rights, if we can make commitments to start to capture data that is meaningful, when we can start to design our programs, our policies by including the people who they're designed to impact. I think that every year that we produce this report, it will bring us a little bit closer to true accountability for the rights of children in Queensland. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'll hand back to you, Mick.
Thanks, Natalie. And these reports, what we found on the Royal Commission into detention and protection of children in the Northern Territory was you really can't write recommendations that tie government to do anything. You can't make them do anything. But what we learned, you had to make what they do transparent so we can hold them to account. And I think, Natalie, this report goes there. It actually holds the government to account, like I said, for what they do, and particularly what they don't do. So thank you for that. I continue to look at people like yourself and Sue-Ann Hunter, advocating for children's rights all over Australia, and just amazed at the great job that you're doing. And I'm always reflected. I spent a fair bit of time in WA. A great leader over there, Rob Riley, used to say, very simple, you can't be wrong if you're right. And you don't stop fighting because you're making people uncomfortable. You just keep fighting. So that's a great mantra to live by. So thank you, Natalie. A key part of this report, as Natalie said, is listening to children's voices. And as a matter of fact, when we had that summit, when we got Natalie convened with Katie Kiss, the Social Justice Commissioner, and Scott McDougall, the Human Rights Commissioner, all the people came together that we remember Natalie said we've got to focus on children's rights. If we're going forward with this government whose first action was to repeal the legislation around treaty, we've got to focus on children's rights. And that was all the people who came together. Marcia Langton, Tony McAvoy, people in positions like Alf Lacey, the Mayor of Palm Island. I just want to go to you, Casey, because you actually key to the Gathering Strength Summit, Young People and Self-Determination. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Mick, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for being at the launch. Before I get started, I too just want to acknowledge Turrbal and Yagara country, pay my respects to their elders past and present. I've been asked to speak today a bit about the process behind this year's Spotlight chapter, and I think it's really important to understand that process. So I think before I get started, just some acknowledgements, and most importantly, just want to acknowledge all the young people, that were part of the Banner and Murrungoo Youth Collective, who shaped this chapter. This work for me reflects your voices, your leadership and your vision for the future. The ideas in this chapter belong to you. And I think that's really important to highlight, and I'll talk a bit about how we got there. I also want to acknowledge, and the chapter talks a lot about the elders who so generously gave their knowledge and time to young people throughout the process of developing this chapter. Uncle Mick Gooda, Uncle Les Melisa, Auntie Henrietta Marie, Professor Marcia Langton, Auntie Leanne Enoch, Garjar Kerry Charlton, of course, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner, Commissioner Lewis, all gave their time across the entirety of this process. And their contributions remind us that real leadership is carried across generations. And the strength of our young people grows when it's grounded in the wisdom of those who came before them. Finally, and part of this process, the Banner and Murrungoo Youth Summit, just want to acknowledge the younger mob from Uramaltha, Jane Dodd, Selena Blakely, Kobe Sellings and Manny Williams, who supported so expertly, the learning and voice of all the young people that were in that room. So I want to start, if I can, with just a story that I think situates an understanding that I hope people can take away and reflect on as they either read or reread the chapter. I think it says everything about the paradigm within which the Spotlight chapter has been developed. The story comes from Professor Langton. She shared a story, and interestingly, right at the start, she jumps on and she tells this story about having a dream to become a scientist. But at the school she was at, she was told that she couldn't continue studying science because, as an Aboriginal student, the teachers assumed that she was not capable. She reflected that that moment broke her heart. And at a subsequent time, Charles Perkins had just returned from the Freedom Ride, and he was becoming one of the most visible Aboriginal activists in the country. As a young Aboriginal woman, Professor Langton decided to write to him and ask what she should do with her life. He wrote back, and as Marcia tells the story, I recount that it was with some surprise that he wrote back. In that letter, he told her that she should follow whatever it was she dreamed to do. Now, Professor Langton later reflected that this simple act, writing back with encouragement, was an act of real power, not loud or forceful power, but power through belief and kindness. The kind of power that gives someone the confidence to keep going, even when the path ahead is difficult. That story for me captures something important about how change occurs. Sometimes power is simply the act of believing that someone belongs in a classroom, in a profession, in a room where decisions are made. And in many ways, the idea is central to the approach behind the Spotlight chapter of this year's report. So as Uncle Mick said, the process behind this chapter has been about focusing on youth participation and self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. It was not written about them. It was developed with them. It is owned by them. A truth I hope is captured through a simple but effective use of first-person narrative within the Spotlight chapter. The Banner and Murrungoo Youth Collective were a group of 25 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. They're aged between 16 and 25. And together they represented 19 communities and more than 47 nations across this country. The strength of the collective, I think, lies in their diversity. A group of young people that had lived the living experience of our statutory systems, that lived with disability, our LGBTQI mob, our brother boys, our sister girls. Young people who were already engaging in the human rights space, and some who, like Professor Langton, had a passion for STEM. They come from urban centres to some of the most remote parts of Queensland and everywhere in between. Above all, these young people brought what mattered most: their experience, their evidence, their leadership, and the power of collective voice. Because we can't talk about participation and self-determination without talking about power. Too often, participation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people occurs within systems where systems determine the boundaries of that conversation. Institutions define the questions, the parameters, and the rules, and young people are invited to contribute within those limits. The young people we spoke to, they spoke openly about this dynamic. They recognised it as a longer history of structural power. The chapter to engage, the request for us was to engage meaningfully with them on the things, the values and the motivations that they had for change. The chapter is about what happens when young people are not simply invited into the conversation, but what happens when they are trusted to shape it. What happens when power is shared rather than held. I want to talk about time horizons because I think this says so much about what the desire of the chapter has to have an intentional impact, which I think is about the time horizons of change. The first horizon is participation in the present, where young people have the space to learn about their rights, speak their truth, share their experiences, contribute their ideas. The second horizon is where participation becomes ownership. Young people begin to influence the agenda, shaping discussions, identifying their priorities for change. And the third horizon, I think, is the most important. This is where sharing power begins to create generational change, when young people experience their voices being taken seriously. They begin to see themselves not simply as participants in systems, but as leaders shaping them. And when that happens, something deeper shifts. The expectations of our next generation will begin to change, where participation is not the exception, it's about the norm. So sometimes I hear, in the hallways of bureaucracy, that impact is measured in more immediate terms, whether it's the number of views we get or the likes we get, the visibility of the immediate moment. But the kind of impact we're talking about may not show up on the dashboard or in a report, although it probably shows up a little bit in this report. Sometimes the only way we'll recognise it is years from now, when I see a young person and point to them and say, I remember them when they were one of the young people in the room. Sometimes when we talk about changing systems, perhaps we too overly focus on the structures, the policies, the institutions. But sometimes real change begins elsewhere. It begins with that seminal moment of inspiration, the seed. A seed might be a young person discovering their voice, a conversation that shifts someone's confidence, a moment when someone realises they belong in a space they were never expected to enter. Seeds are small, but they carry the possibility of so much potential. Because tomorrow's change, I see, is already beginning to grow quietly inside the seeds that we plant today. So let me finish with this. That letter from Charles Perkins should remind us all that a small gesture planted something much greater. And from small things, big things can grow. That story reminds us that power does not always look like authority and control. Sometimes the most powerful act is the belief and kindness we share with a young person, and then watch what happens from there. Thanks, Mick.
Geez, mate, what great words. So thank you, from the heart. Great messages. And I'm reflecting on the Gathering Strength Summit, but also what I'm old enough to remember we had our own rhetoric in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander world about we've got to listen to young people. And I remember going to a summit in Canberra years ago, and these young people approached me and said, look, we're hearing that, but then we get told we're upstarts and we should just sit back and listen. I think people like Natalie and yourself and Rhea are actually leading the way to make sure children and young people's voices are heard. And it's a human rights. And they're saying children's rights are human rights, Indigenous rights. And, you know, one of the most important rights we have is the right to participate in decisions that affect us. And who are more affected by these changes that we experience right now than children and young people? So again, Natalie and Casey and the rest of the team, Amy and everyone else in the commission, I've got to give a heartfelt thanks for elevating the voices of young people, because it fulfills that need to listen. And Casey, during your presentation, you mentioned the truth. I tell you what, I've been working in truth telling, and the minute you tell someone's truth to someone else, they'll try to dismantle it. And I've recently had an experience like that where I was told what I was telling this organisation wasn't right. And I said, well, but that's their truth. You cannot deny that's just their truth. I actually talk to people and I don't make them swear on a stack of Bibles before I take their views on board. And that issue of truth is really important. We've got to sit back and listen to their truth. It's their truth and we cannot deny their truth. So again, thank you. Rhea, I'm just going to hand over to you. You know, your foreword says that all. Talk to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start off by saying kapukut. Kapukut in my language means good afternoon. That's the language of Sub Island. My name is Rhea Waia, and I'm a proud Torres Strait Islander, Zanathikas, on my father's side, and I belong to the Atkaral clan of Sub Island. On my mother's side, I'm a proud Punjabi Indian, and my land belongs to Punjab, which is around Amritsar. Yeah, so I speak from my roots today, and I'd also like to, welcome. Well, I would also like to acknowledge how welcomed I feel on Yagara Turrbal land as well, alongside many strong people in my life, including Auntie Nat, who's a really strong matriarch. Uncle Mick and Uncle Casey as well. You guys have guided me to be here today, and welcomed me and made me feel very safe. Yeah. I suppose read the foreword. Let me know what you think. So far, it's good. And I will reflect that I was very angry when I wrote the foreword. I was feeling very, I guess, built up within my heart about the systemic genocide children and young people experience, and my pain for my brothers and my sisters, my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, young peoples. And so I wrote it, and honestly, writing it in itself was a relief. I sent it through, and I'm glad it was reciprocated in the same way, because it's come from the heart. When you read it, you will feel it with you. And I think you should, because if you're authentic to yourself, you will feel. It's painful what's happening for children and young people. So I'm in my role today as I can, in my best capacity, to advocate on behalf of young people and children. I think the summit really brought a lot of realizations forward. Not only were we exploring what rights are, how it's defined constitutionally, but for me as a young person, it was overwhelming to sit amongst all my Aboriginal young and Torres Strait Islander children and young people and see the realizations about what we are denied, as well as the simultaneous awareness we're gaining. And when I reflect more and more on it, I'm doing my master's in my human rights, and I reflect how much of our rights are shaped within a Western way. And so if we're not addressing the structural inequalities and the colonial legacies and the institutional practices, what Arnie said was right. Our rights become symbolic rather than having the ability to transform someone to freedom. And this is what young people are asking for at the moment, children and young people. They're asking for governments and non-government to shift authority, to release control of the systems that they may be contributing towards that are dominant and Western, and instead embedding harm. They are asking for a shift in authority, and through that is shared decision making, it's shared power as well. And it's also the ability to think about rights from a relational perspective rather than it being given to us through that constitutional lens as well. You have to understand that, okay, what it looks like on paper here looks very different to grassroots here. And you have to allow your heart and your mind and your eyes to open up the perspectives. Maybe I am influenced through a dominant definition. Maybe I have been influenced through dominant systems that have changed my perception for a child and a young person. So, and the root of it is self-determination. I think this is what I'm doing right now as a young person, as contribution towards my legacy, as contribution towards my clan, as contribution to the way I serve my community here on Yagara Turrbal land, on Kondamuka land, and as a Saibai Islander I speak. My contribution is how am I contributing to another person's self-determination? Because this is mutual. When I give, I will also receive as well. And that's what we rely on to get through. Young people, children rely on the wisdom of self-determination from our elders and our ancestors. So how am I impacting that journey? Is it a good way? Is it in a bad way? Because this is what will provide us with the freedom. And I think the root of it is self-determination, but also it's critical reflection. And, you know, I'm a social worker, so I talk a lot about critical reflection, but I have embedded a lot of it personally within my life too, because if you're not reflecting, you're not evolving your consciousness. You're not evolving your awareness about something, and you could be missing in your hindsight, you could be missing something, and you could be perpetrating some harm in a way you don't know. So I think everyone has that responsibility, including myself. I'm a black fella, and yet I owe that responsibility to everyone here, to black fellas and non-Indigenous peoples, for me to be questioning my role here, sitting as an advocate, as a practitioner, as a person, questioning my role. Am I challenging dominant systems, challenging assumptions, challenging definitions, or am I a part of reproducing it? What am I doing to ensure a child and young person is free? And when we look at freedom, we look at it holistically. We think, how can I contribute to a child and young person's social freedom, psychological freedom, emotional freedom, spiritual freedom, traditional freedom? How can I do that? That's what I'm doing. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. Just a bit of that reflection. Thank you.
That's pretty deadly, mate. I've got a couple of comments I want to make. One is, you said you wrote the foreword when you were angry. I've got a friend who went to medical school in Melbourne Uni and got really angry about, you know, being taught that they are the elite in the Melbourne Uni and therefore they're going to be elite doctors when they come out, and she hated it. And she had a sign on her house saying, if you're not angry, you're not taking notice. And so I think you've got to have something that fires you, and I think you've said it, but you've also balanced that with, because one of the worst things I see in particularly our women, if they get tagged as being angry black women, that's it. You don't have to take notice of it. But now you talk about self-reflection, you're doing a master's, you're able to sit down and argue clearly and do that critical thinking that's needed, and I think that's what we need. The other comment I want to make is you acknowledge everything about you, your Torres Strait Saibai culture, but also your Indian culture. And I'm noticing that is a big change with our young people now. They want to know, they want to acknowledge every part of them, and they're not going to get tagged with just being, if I can say it, a one-trick pony. So can I say really thanks for that as well, to say, because we're the sum total of everything that puts us together, aren't we? All parts of our families and histories that bring us together. Like I said, it was the last thing, but it's not. I think I love how it's going to emerge with Zenith Kess is the name for the Torres Strait. And I think the kids being born today, you know, there's a big outcry about naming Fraser Island Gari. You know, the kids born today will only know it as Gari. The kids in the Torres Strait will, and all of Australia will know it as Zenith Kess, not Torres Strait, some named after some Spanish guy. I don't think he even went there, that fella.
Yeah. Thank you, Uncle. It means a lot.
So more strength, okay?
Yeah, more strength. That's it.
We've got a bit of time now if people want to write in some questions, but I've got a couple I want to start with. Natalie, to you, what do you think with this report? It calls it besides everything else, it's a call to action. What do you think the child rights response should be required right now in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious things that you know that jump out, and you know, when we talk about, you know, things like the child protection system or the youth justice system, where we see, you know, today being Closing the Gap Day, and where we see sort of progress in, you know, in the wrong direction when it comes to those two you know, critical areas. So what we've tried to do is to, you know, to present some options about how to think about those two policy areas differently going forward. But it all connects back to the point I made earlier around a children's plan, because when we continue, you know, when we see data is looking bad in a particular area, or there are too many stories on the news about a particular you know, system, we jump to this crisis response like every single time, and we lose the opportunity to step back and say, if we want to, across the long term, how do we want to truly transform these systems and children's experiences of it? It forces us to look at the reasons that children are in contact with those systems, rather than trying to think that somehow we can gussy up that system to somehow make it safe for children. So I think that being able to really be reflective, you know, but also look at things like the answers to a child protection system to improve outcomes for children are not going to be found in the child protection system. Certainly not in the tertiary child protection system, where we continue to focus far too much, you know, far too much of the resources. If we step back and we say, okay, let's look at things like health equity. Let's make sure that all of our children are born to mums that have been supported through their pregnancies, that you know, where children are born healthy, where they have equitable access to quality early childhood services, where they live in homes that are safe, and there's stability, and there's some knowledge that they've got somewhere that they can call home for a period of time. You know, I think there's all of these things that impact the lives of children and the rights of children, that culminate often when those needs are unmet in you know, contact with child protection systems or contact with youth justice systems. And instead of focusing on those things, the things that bring them to that attention, we continue to invest in failure in systems that are about, you know, disconnection, that have year after year produced poor outcomes for children and young people. And I think that the only way I think that we can do that across the entire continuum is to think generationally about children, position their rights as priorities in this state, and start to look at those ways that we can bring together portfolios that traditionally opt out of responsibility for upholding the rights of children. So yeah, I think, like I said earlier, I mean, the core recommendation is really centered around a children's a children's plan in Queensland. I guess outside of that, Mick, I think the other thing that's really, really important is to make sure that our children and young people have an awareness that they have rights. When we first brought together a group of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it was heartbreaking for many of them to not have known that those rights, that those rights applied to them. They honestly, had such limited awareness about the very basic human rights that they have here in Queensland. And so children can't advocate for rights that they don't know they have. And so being committed to promoting awareness around children's rights, ramping up the effort in a human rights jurisdiction so that people have access to that information, have ways to not just raise complaints, but to access, real remedy when it comes to violations of their rights. Those types of things are really key as we go forward.
Thanks, Natalie. I think the way we frame it and the way I've grown up into a generation of rights, wasn't when I was young, we never even heard of rights. And now we're passing that baton on to young people to carry on. It's now become, I think about we make progress when it becomes unremarkable that our young people are arguing from a basis of rights. So I think that's really important. Rhea, I've got a question for you from the audience, and it's about your foreword. You wrote elegantly and passionately about not wanting a seat at your table and that you're building your own. Would you have examples of government agencies who have shown courage in joining your table?
This agency, probably the first, real transparent, proper, mutual respect, genuine is what is happening here with Aninat and, the reference group that went within the summit as well. This is what it feels like for me when you're met at the table that you have designed, because I'm not going to simplify it or downplay how I feel as a young person being in Queensland. Yeah. So that's what I mean. That there are people who are afraid of taking the accountability that they need to take within the lived experience that I've felt within the systems that they govern. Accountability is taken here because I'm sitting here talking, given the opportunity to have this yarn with you. So this is what it means to be met at my own table. I feel that I can speak fluently and I can, write a speech that I'm angry about and submit it, and it's untouched, not even edited. It's my words because it's my truth. That's what it means.
And that's why I talked about your truth. This is your truth. No one can argue with your truth. And I love the metaphor about tables, because I don't know if you recall Prime Minister Carney from Canada at his Davos speech. But I love this line: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And
that's a good one.
Well, we can't be on the menu anymore.
No.
What do you reckon, Casey? Have you ever seen, like Rhea talked about, of course, the Children's Commission does that. How do we actually get the other departments to sit at that table?
I think back to what John Tobin said in his opening statement, Uncle Mick, I think he said, the challenge now is how we respond. And I think the truth is in that statement that we just haven't done it yet. We shouldn't, I don't think we should sit here and try and kid ourselves about the idea that we've done it. And we might have achieved it here this one time, Rhea, but we can't stop at just that one time. It's got to be something that's built in and enduring. It's got to be sustainable if we want sustainable change. So I think that's the best way I can answer it, is to say, here is a group of young people that have shared their truth so openly, and the next thing that happens, that is how adults respond, is the most, the next most important thing that we need to see happen. And there's lots of opportunities for us to continue to expand and develop how we do that.
Yeah, I reflect, Casey and Rhea, on I'm on another organisation. I won't name it because I don't embarrass anyone, but it came a push from the young people wanted to set a committee up in young Indigenous people in Queensland, and we went to the board, and I sat there listening while they discussed this, and when the chair finally came to me, and I said, I think you just got to come to grips. It's going to happen whether we approve it or not, and because they're going to get together. And this is the power where I'm seeing the change emerging within organisations now. And my point was, we might as well invite them in, otherwise they're just going to knock the door down and come in. And I think the point these people had to get their heads around, it's going to happen whether we endorse it or not. There's going to be a voice for young Indigenous people in the system. And I was so proud of them for doing that. And finally, them other people around the table sort of started nodding their heads, because I said, you can't stop it now. You can't stop. Once they get the idea that they're going to get together, what are we going to do? Ban them from talking to each other? So anyway, it was really interesting to do that. So I just want to go back, final question. And I mentioned before how we used to pay lip service. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, leaders would pay lip service to young people, but now we're really listening. What do you think we get wrong, both adults and institutions, when we try to engage in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children?
I might jump in and have one go at it.
You have a crack,
Mick.
Casey?
Yeah, I think, I said right up the front of what I was talking about, that intergenerational knowledge transfer that occurred in the development of this chapter. I think it has been so important. And to your point, the lip service that may have been paid by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations about, hearing young people, seeing yourself and some elders that have been, in this space for 30, 40 years, sharing your wisdom and your experience with young people. I could just, I could see the growth for young people out of just having that experience. So I would simply say space and time, giving young people our space, giving young people space and our time is vital. We don't have to tell them what to do, but we have to give them their space and our time. And then we can see what happens, because I think this is the bit that chokes me up writing the report, or seeing young people like Rhea talk now, is you can to your point, they're going to step through that door whether we ask them or not, and that's the thing I think is so heartening.
Yeah. Final comments, Rhea?
Yes, I just wanted to contribute as well. I think when I think about that question, Uncle, I think, what are adults or institutions, or both doing wrong? What I feel as a young person, and when I was a child, navigating adults in Western systems, there is no real acknowledgement of loss. And so it becomes very difficult to navigate these systems that are supposed to protect you, these systems that are supposed to guide you and navigate you, that when there is no acknowledgement of the ongoing loss. So the ongoing loss, we are bearing intergenerational loss too, our patriarchs and our matriarchs, the people, the generation above us, and then we're also above them as well. So it's many generations. We hold that loss, and then we also, as young people and children, we also are living our own loss, are living our loss of language, extinction of animals, meat, for example.
Yeah.
but you would cook for feasting. You know, loss of traditional sacred space, loss of land. We are grieving this as well as our old people and ancestors reacting and responding to the loss on country. So when you're not met like that, that's the harm that's created, is that, oh, I can't rely on you as a system. I can't rely on you to navigate me, to guide me, or protect me. And I'm not even heard about what I'm losing right now. So loss is a big one for me from my lived experience.
Thank you. And Natalie, we're getting close to time, but I want to give you the thing about final comments.
Yeah, I think look, thanks for that, Mick, and thanks for your thoughts, Casey and Rhea. I think for me, the process of doing the child rights and report, but also the approach that we take to our work, the key lesson is about the participation of children and young people, and I have previously fallen fallen short, and when we take this approach to participation where we rock and make this really dangerous assumption that young people actually want to talk to us about the thing that we've decided is going to be in their interests, or the program we've designed, or the policy that we're contemplating, we miss an incredible opportunity to return to centre and have young people be the ones to articulate the types of needs that they have and the aspirations they have. Instead of going to them and asking them, what do you think about this program, or what do you think about this particular policy? Ask them what makes them safe and well. Ask them, and from there you actually start to build a response that is worthy of their participation. And so I think the more that we can do that, the better we will be in Queensland, and the closer that we will get to being a rights affirming jurisdiction that keeps Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and all children in Queensland at the centre of the decisions that we make.
Yeah. But I just want to close off by thanking everyone who joined us here today. Particular thanks to Casey, Rhea, and of course our great commissioner. Take the report away. The beauty of reports is that they don't just sit on a shelf. Use it. Use the arguments in there for anything that you're going to advocate for in children's rights. It's a story of children's rights from them in Queensland. Use it. We're going to email it out to people. We think with everyone who's joined us here today. But can I just thank you all for coming and look, let's say it, celebrating the release of this report, even though there's pretty hard stuff in there. It's a time that we should celebrate the release of this report and the efforts of Natalie and her team in getting it together. So with that, I'm going to close off and thank you all for joining us.